The door creaked open, a faint, eerie sound in the dead of night. But inside the house, all was silent, unnervingly silent. It was as if the world itself held its breath. A German shepherd, eyes wide with a piercing intensity, stood frozen in the center of the living room. Her body was tense, rigid as a statue. But it wasn't just her stillness that made the moment feel like time had stopped. It was what she was guarding, what she was protecting with every fiber of her being. At her paws, curled and trembling, was a tiny puppy, barely alive. The little creature's breaths were shallow, its body twitching sporadically, its heart struggling to beat. A chill ran down the man's spine as he stood at the door, watching the incredible sight before him. The mother, a fierce protector, refused to move. Her gaze never wavered from the lifeless body of her child. "What's going on here?" he muttered to himself, the question lingering in the air as he took a cautious step forward. The puppy's almost imperceptible whimper sent a shudder through the man. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. Why had she frozen like this? Why was she standing guard over a lifeless puppy that appeared to have no chance of survival? The German shepherd's fur stood on end as she watched him closely. Her eyes locked onto his, sending an unmistakable message. "Don't come any closer. Don't even think about it." The intensity of her stare was chilling, a raw emotion in her eyes. Fear, desperation, and an undying love for the life she had birthed. A wave of confusion and disbelief washed over him. He was no stranger to animals and their behaviors, but this was different. The bond between mother and puppy was undeniable, but it was more than just maternal instinct at play. There was something deeper here. Something beyond comprehension. The air seemed to thicken with tension as he inched closer, trying to understand the scene unfolding before him. Was the puppy alive? Could it be saved? Or had time run out? Before he could make another move, the shepherd let out a low growl, a sound that rattled him to his core. It wasn't a warning, it was a plea. She wasn't just protecting her pup from him, she was protecting it from something else. Something unseen, something far more dangerous. In the stillness of the room, the man suddenly noticed something else. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, something unnatural. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the scent was coming from the puppy. Blood. The puppy had been injured. But how? And why hadn't the shepherd moved? 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind as he stood frozen in the doorway, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. Was the puppy beyond saving? Was the shepherd truly unable to do anything, or was she waiting for something, for him to do something, that would change everything? Then, as if the room itself had come alive with a strange, unseen force, the shepherd's body seemed to relax ever so slightly, just enough for the man to see a flicker of movement beneath her. The puppy, weak but still clinging to life, shifted slightly. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough to spark a thread of hope. The man swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke into the silence. "You're not alone, girl. I'll help. We'll figure this out." But even as he said the words, he didn't truly know what he was offering. Could he save the puppy? Could anything be done at this point? It seemed as if the world had shifted into a strange, fragile balance where every second counted. As the man stepped further into the room, something stirred at the edges of his perception. A faint, distant sound, like a whisper in the wind, seemed to echo from somewhere outside the house. It was soft at first, but gradually it grew louder, like the sound of approaching footsteps. No, something more sinister, more ominous. The man froze again. The shepherd's ears perked up in an instant, her body stiffening once more. She snarled low and guttural, her gaze darting toward the door. A strange feeling surged through him. This was no longer just about a puppy's survival. This was about something far greater. He glanced down at the puppy again. The life within it was fading fast. The clock was ticking. But something else had entered the room, something dark and unknown, and it was closing in with every passing second. "Get ready," he whispered, a chill running through his veins. Whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. The shepherd's growl grew louder, more desperate, as the man reached for the door handle. He had to act fast. There was no time to waste. And as he slowly turned the knob, he braced himself for what lay on the other side, for what this frozen moment had been leading to all along. The moment the door creaked open, The man's heart began to pound. A sharp, almost palpable pressure filled the air, thick with anticipation and dread. The shepherd's growl intensified as her eyes locked onto the door, a clear warning to anyone daring to approach. Her muscles tensed, coiled and ready to spring into action, even though her body still hovered protectively over her near-dead puppy. The man took a cautious step into the room, his every movement deliberate. He had never felt such a palpable fear in the air before, an unspoken understanding that something far beyond his control was happening. The puppy at the shepherd's feet was still barely breathing, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. The blood was no longer just a stain on its fur, it seemed to be the only thing tethering the little creature to life. As the man approached, the shepherd's growl deepened, vibrating in her chest. It was low and menacing, more than just a defensive warning. It was a plea, a warning of an imminent threat that the man couldn't yet comprehend. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to give her space, but something deep within him urged him to stay, to do something, anything, to help the helpless pup. He could feel his throat tighten. He had worked with animals before, trained them, rehabilitated them, but this was something else entirely. This was fear of the unknown, a dread that came from something beyond the normal laws of nature. The air in the room felt charged, thick with a strange energy, as if the very walls were closing in. But it wasn't just the puppy's fate that held the man's attention. He felt an unseen force moving in the darkness. A whisper in the back of his mind, barely audible but unmistakable, "Something is coming." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heartbeat quickened. He could no longer ignore it. He turned his gaze back to the shepherd. Her posture was rigid, and her eyes never left the door, now wide open. She was watching, waiting, as though something in the room was about to break the fragile silence. She wasn't just defending her pup anymore. She was preparing for a confrontation, one that the man had yet to fully understand. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the room was unbearable. The man looked down at the puppy again. It was barely alive. Its tiny body was no longer twitching as it had been earlier. Its chest barely moved, and the weak, rhythmic sound of its breathing was almost imperceptible. The shepherd had not taken her eyes off the puppy for a single moment, her gaze intense, desperate, and full of sorrow. She wasn't going to move. She couldn't. Her world revolved around the fragile life at her feet, and the slightest movement could shatter it. "Come on, girl," the man muttered, taking a step closer. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over the puppy, unsure of how to proceed. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you." The shepherd's body stiffened. Her growl deepened. She was ready to strike if necessary. But before the man could make another move, the room seemed to shift. The oppressive silence that had weighed on the room cracked with an unmistakable sound, footsteps. Faint at first, but growing steadily louder. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of iron, of blood, filled the man's nostrils. It was coming from the hallway. Someone, or something, was moving toward the room. The man's heart slammed against his ribcage. His instincts kicked into overdrive. The shepherd's eyes flashed with a sudden, terrifying clarity. She was no longer guarding just her puppy. She was protecting something more, something they both feared. "Stay," the man whispered to the shepherd, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. The command was more for himself than her. He needed to focus. His mind raced, searching for answers, but the truth of the situation eluded him. What was happening here? Why had the shepherd frozen? Why was she guarding this puppy with such intensity? And why did it feel as if something else was coming, something that had been waiting for this moment? The footsteps outside grew louder, now unmistakably close. The man's fingers grazed the puppy's small body, feeling the heat of its fragile skin, its tiny chest rising and falling in what could only be called a final struggle. A wave of helplessness surged through him. He was too late, wasn't he? The puppy was already beyond saving. Suddenly, the shepherd snarled, louder, more viciously than before. Her eyes locked onto the hallway, her growl so low it rumbled through the floorboards. The man felt a chill run down his spine. The footsteps had stopped. It was too quiet now. The silence was oppressive. Before he could react, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was shrouded in shadow, its face hidden, but the presence was undeniable. A cold wave of energy radiated from the figure, one that made the hair on the back of the man's neck stand on end. His breath caught in his throat. The shepherd's growl intensified, but she remained still, her body tense, almost as though she was waiting for permission to attack. The figure stepped forward, the shadowy form moving fluidly, unnaturally, into the light. The man's eyes narrowed. There was something deeply unsettling about the figure's appearance. The air seemed to shift around it, warping slightly, as if reality itself bent at its presence. The man didn't need to see its face to understand that whatever this was, it wasn't human. The energy, the unnatural chill that filled the room, it was clear. It was not of this world. And it had come for something. But what? The figure reached down toward the puppy. It moved with such precision that it almost seemed too deliberate, too calm. Its hand extended toward the small, lifeless body of the pup, but as it did, the shepherd lunged. She was faster than the man could follow, her teeth bared in a ferocious snarl, her body a blur of motion. The man watched in stunned silence as the shepherd collided with the figure, her claws raking through the air, her powerful jaws snapping at whatever she had locked onto. But the figure didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice her attack. The shepherd's body hit the floor with a harsh thud, her growl faltering. She staggered to her feet, her eyes wide with confusion. She hadn't hurt it. She couldn't hurt it. The man's pulse raced. What kind of creature was this? What was happening to his world? His gaze snapped back to the puppy. It was still alive, just barely, but the seconds were slipping away, and the mystery of the creature before him was only deepening. The figure bent down, as if examining the puppy. Its hand hovered above the fragile body, and the man held his breath, unsure of what would happen next. But the air seemed to pulse, and for a brief moment, time itself appeared to freeze. Everything, the shepherd, the man, the figure, the puppy, stood suspended in that one moment. Then, without warning, a voice filled the room. It was a low murmur, barely audible, but it echoed in the man's mind with bone-chilling clarity. "She is not yours to save." The room seemed to hold its breath. The very air felt thicker, charged with an eerie energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. The man stood frozen, staring at the figure in the doorway. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend what was unfolding. What was this creature? Why was it here, and why did it seem to be so interested in the shepherd's puppy? The puppy, barely clinging to life, lay still on the floor, its breaths shallow and erratic. Its small form appeared fragile, almost lifeless. Every instinct in the man screamed to rush forward, to protect the helpless creature. But something about the figure made him hesitate, rooted in place by a primal fear he couldn't quite explain. The shepherd's eyes never left the figure. She was trembling now, her body taut with tension, her growls reverberating through the room like distant thunder. Despite the obvious exhaustion in her movements, she stood her ground, unwilling to back down. The man could see the conflict in her eyes, a deep, unspoken question of whether she could actually protect the puppy against something so unnatural. Then, without warning, the figure took another step forward, its presence seemingly bending the air around it. Its movement was fluid, almost graceful, but there was a coldness to it that felt wrong, like watching a predator stalk its prey. It didn't make a sound as it approached, its eyes locked on the puppy, every step measured and deliberate. The shepherd let out a low, guttural growl, a warning she had made clear time and time again. But the figure did not flinch. It simply knelt down in front of the puppy, its face still obscured by shadow. The man could feel his breath catch in his throat. He had no idea what this thing was capable of. Could it hurt the dog? Could it do something worse? "Stay back," the man hissed, his voice low and strained. He felt his fingers twitch, itching for the weapon he hadn't brought, an impulse born of desperation. But the figure paid no attention to the man's warning. Instead, it reached out with an impossibly long hand, fingers tapering like claws, and brushed them against the puppy's fur. The air seemed to ripple around the touch, as if reality itself was warping in response. The man's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't understand what was happening. The puppy didn't react. It didn't move. And then, the room seemed to darken. A heavy weight pressed down on everything, the walls, the floor, the very air around them. The shepherd, though strong, visibly shrank under the oppressive presence of the creature. Her growls faltered, becoming quieter as though her strength was being drained, piece by piece. The man's mind raced. What was happening to her? She had always been strong, always resolute. And now she was faltering. The figure leaned closer to the puppy, its shadow completely enveloping it. There was no sound, no motion. It was as if time itself had stopped. And then, for a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Utter, suffocating silence. The man could feel his heartbeat thudding in his chest as he dared to take a step forward. But before he could move, the figure spoke, not aloud, but in his mind. "She is the one who will lead us. Not you. Not her." The words reverberated through the man's skull, making his knees buckle under the weight of their meaning. Led them. The puppy. What was the creature talking about? His mouth went dry. He could feel his pulse quickening, his breath shallow and erratic. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything. But his body didn't move. He felt paralyzed, caught in the grip of an invisible force. His eyes flicked between the puppy, the shepherd, and the figure. It was as if he had no control over his own actions, no say in what was happening. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible shift, the atmosphere in the room changed. The oppressive pressure lifted, as if the figure had released its hold on the air itself. The shepherd's body jerked upright, her eyes wide with renewed vigor. The man could see it now. Her fear had shifted into something else. Something sharper. Her instincts, her protectiveness, had taken over once more. The figure stood motionless, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for a response, for a challenge. And then, with an explosion of energy, the shepherd lunged. She moved faster than the man could follow, her body a blur of motion as she tackled the figure with a ferocity born of desperation. Her teeth bared, she went for the creature's neck, her powerful jaws snapping at its throat. But the figure was ready. Without even flinching, it raised an arm, its long, spindly fingers intercepting the attack mid-air, like a wall of steel. The shepherd was thrown back as if struck by an invisible force. She hit the floor hard, rolling onto her side, her body skidding across the wooden planks. The man's heart raced as he watched the shepherd scramble to her feet, her eyes now blazing with rage and defiance. "Why?" The man finally managed to speak, his voice raw with emotion. "What do you want from her?" The figure tilted its head, a curious gesture, as if the question was one it hadn't quite anticipated. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in that same haunting, otherworldly voice, it responded. "We take what is ours. She is ours, not yours." The words rang in the man's ears, a chilling declaration that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The puppy, the shepherd, they were not just in danger. They were part of something much bigger. The figure's eyes, hidden in the shadows, flickered with what might have been amusement or perhaps contempt. "You cannot save her. She is already claimed." The words stung like a slap to the face. The man clenched his fists, his knuckles white with anger. He wouldn't accept that. He couldn't let this creature take her. He couldn't let it take the puppy either. No, his voice was a low growl. "Not today." The shepherd's eyes met his, her gaze filled with a raw, burning intensity. The battle wasn't over yet. No matter the cost, she was going to fight for her pup. She was going to fight for herself. And in that moment, the man made a choice. He was going to stand by her. He was going to fight, too. The room trembled with a primal force, the very air vibrating with the energy of an impending clash. The man's eyes were fixed on the creature, every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring into action. The shepherd, her fur bristling with fury and resolve, stood between the figure and the puppy, her eyes locked on her enemy with a fierce protectiveness that defied the unnatural presence before them. "You can't take her," the man shouted, his voice raw with determination, his words not just an assertion but a plea. "Not today." The figure's laugh was almost imperceptible, but it echoed in the man's mind like a distant thunderclap. It was cold, mocking, and utterly devoid of empathy. "You don't understand. She has already been chosen." The words resonated in the man's skull, an unearthly vibration that made his teeth ache. The bond has already been made. Her fate is sealed. The man's heart pounded, each beat a desperate cry for the survival of the puppy. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what the creature was saying. What did it mean? The shepherd's protective stance, her growls, were the only things between the puppy and the creature's deadly intent. But what could they do? How could they fight something that seemed so powerful, so unyielding? As the creature's presence loomed over them, the room grew darker, the light flickering as though something malevolent was slowly consuming it. The air itself felt cold, like a winter's chill had settled into their bones. The puppy, who had been still, barely breathing, began to stir again, its tiny body shifting, its weak breaths sounding more labored than before. But then, something changed. A spark. The shepherd's body tensed, every inch of her attuned to the energy in the room. The figure's eyes gleamed with an unreadable expression, as though it were watching her with a strange sense of fascination. The man, barely able to move, barely able to think straight, felt the heat of the moment radiating off both of them. It was coming down to this. With a snarl, the shepherd lunged again, but this time, her movements were different. She was faster, more precise. Her fury had transformed into something sharper, more focused, as though she had tapped into a primal reserve of strength. She tore through the air, moving like a force of nature, her teeth bared, her eyes burning with determination. And yet, the figure did not retreat. Instead, it shifted, almost lazily, stepping to the side with an elegance that made the shepherd's assault seem almost futile. In one swift motion, it raised a hand and pressed it against her chest. The energy that surged from its palm was like a shock wave, sending the shepherd sprawling to the ground, her body writhing under the weight of an unseen force. The man cried out, desperate to help her, but he was frozen in place, his legs unresponsive as though his body refused to cooperate. The shepherd, struggling to stand, let out a growl, a low, defiant sound that sent a ripple through the room. She was not finished yet. Not by a long shot. But even as the creature seemed to toy with her, there was something more at play here, something the man could feel but couldn't yet fully understand. The bond between the shepherd and the puppy was stronger than anything he had witnessed before. The connection they shared was not simply one of caretaker and dependent, but of something far more ancient and powerful. It was as if they were two parts of a whole, connected by something beyond physical understanding. The figure seemed to sense it too. Its eyes narrowed as it looked at the puppy, who was now twitching with increasing urgency. The man's heart raced. What was happening? What was it sensing? And then it happened. The puppy, with a soft whimper, began to rise. It wasn't much at first. Just a shift in its tiny body, a weak stretch of its limbs, but there was something in the air, something electric, that made the man's heart skip a beat. The shepherd, still recovering from the figure's blow, caught sight of her pup and immediately pushed herself up. Her legs shook, but she stood, unwavering, her eyes fixed on the creature before her. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest of moments, the man thought he saw a flash of something almost unnatural. The creature's attention snapped to the tiny form, and a low growl rumbled in its chest. It seemed unsettled, as if it couldn't comprehend what was happening. The shepherd took a step forward, and as if drawn by some invisible force, the puppy followed. A single, almost inaudible whine left the puppy's mouth as it stumbled toward the shepherd, who nuzzled it gently, offering silent comfort. But there was something more, something in the air around them that was shifting. The figure recoiled slightly, its expression changing, as though it were realizing that things were not unfolding as it had planned. It took a step back, its form rippling slightly, like the edges of reality were warping around it. The man felt the weight of the moment, the danger closing in on all sides, but something in the puppy's movement, a flicker of strength, of resolve, gave him hope. They weren't done yet. The battle was far from over. The shepherd's growl grew louder, fiercer, as she took a defensive stance. The puppy, now fully standing, stepped forward on unsteady legs, its body trembling but its spirit unwavering. The man could see the look in their eyes, the bond between them, the shared will to fight for survival. He could feel it too. Suddenly, the figure extended its hand once more, but this time, something was different. There was no hesitation in the movement, no grace. It was raw, unfiltered power, the air crackling with the force of it. The shepherd lunged, her teeth flashing, her body propelled by a surge of energy. The puppy, though small, stood beside her, its stance firm as if it had found something it hadn't known it possessed. The creature's hand met the shepherd mid-air, and there was an explosion of light, the force of it sending the man flying backward. The room erupted into chaos as the walls cracked, the floor splintered under the intensity of the collision. But then, amidst the chaos, a strange stillness fell. The man opened his eyes, struggling to stand, his vision blurry. The figure was gone, its presence evaporated as though it had never been there at all. And the shepherd? She stood, her body trembling but unbroken. The puppy, too, stood beside her, its tiny form now brimming with a new-found energy, its eyes clear and full of life. For a moment, all was silent. And then, in a single fleeting moment, everything changed. The shepherd and her puppy, united by an unspoken bond, stood victorious. Against all odds, they had triumphed, not just over the creature, but over the fear, the uncertainty, the darkness that had loomed over them. The man, now on his feet, could only watch in awe. The battle was over. And yet, the journey they had embarked on was far from finished.